At 23, most women are picking out cocktail dresses and swiping on dating apps. Beatrice Hayes was standing at the altar, shaking in a custom silk gown, marrying a 70-year-old mob boss. The arrangement was simple. Her father's $500,000 blood debt erased in exchange for one thing: an heir. Beatrice Hayes was not the kind of girl who turned heads on the cobblestone streets of Boston's North End. At 240 pounds, she was a soft, heavy-set woman who had spent her entire youth wearing oversized aprons and hiding behind the display cases of her family's struggling pastry shop. In a city obsessed with marathon runners and sleek university students, Beatrice was entirely invisible. She liked it that way. It was safe. But invisibility couldn't protect her from the ghosts her father left behind. Arthur Hayes had died of a sudden heart attack 3 weeks prior, leaving Beatrice with a failing bakery, a stack of overdue utility bills, and a secret that would shatter her quiet world. Arthur hadn't just been a terrible businessman. He had been a compulsive gambler. And he hadn't borrowed from the banks. He had borrowed from the remnants of the Patriarca crime family. Specifically, a ruthless faction now controlled by the Rossetti Syndicate. The reality of this crashed into Beatrice on a rainy Tuesday night. She was scraping dried cannoli cream off the countertops when the bells above the bakery door chimed. 3 men in tailored dark wool coats stepped in, flipping the open sign to closed and locking the deadbolt. At the center was Tommy Knuckles Graziano, a notorious enforcer whose name was whispered in hushed, terrified tones in the back alleys of Hanover Street. "Arthur's little girl," Tommy sneered, his eyes raking over her full figure with unfiltered disgust. "Your old man left a tab. 500 grand. We're here to collect." Beatrice's heart hammered against her ribs. I don't have that. The bakery is mortgaged to the hilt. I have nothing." "Then you belong to the boss now," Tommy said, nodding to his men. They didn't give her time to scream. A heavy hand clamped over her mouth, and she was dragged through the back door, shoved into the leather-lined trunk of a waiting black Cadillac Escalade, and driven deep into the heart of the Massachusetts elite, a sprawling, fortress-like estate in Brookline. When Beatrice was finally pulled from the car, shivering and covered in a dusting of confectioner's sugar and terror, she was escorted into a mahogany-paneled library that smelled of expensive scotch and old cigars. Sitting behind a massive oak desk was Don Carmine Rossetti. At 70 years old, Carmine was a relic of a bygone era of the Cosa Nostra. He was impeccably dressed in a charcoal Brioni suit, his silver hair slicked back, his face deeply lined with decades of violence, power, and grief. He was the undisputed king of the Boston underworld, a man who had survived the bloody gang wars of the 90s, outlived the Angiulo brothers, and crushed anyone who dared defy him. But looking at him, Beatrice noticed the slight tremor in his liver-spotted hands. He was a king, yes, but he was a dying king. "Sit, Miss Hayes," Carmine commanded. His voice was like gravel scraping against glass, quiet, but it commanded absolute obedience. Beatrice sank into a plush leather chair, her large frame trembling. "Please," she whispered, tears spilling over her flushed cheeks. "I don't have the money. Take the bakery. Take my life insurance. Just—" "I don't want your bakery, Beatrice," Carmine interrupted, pouring 2 glasses of amber liquid. He slid one across the desk to her. "And your life is of no use to me if it's ended. I am a businessman, and right now I have a very specific problem that requires a very specific solution. Carmine stood up, walking slowly around the desk with the aid of a silver-tipped cane. 2 years ago, my only surviving son, Vincenzo, was gunned down in a drive-by. My wife passed away a decade ago. I have no direct bloodline left. What I do have is a pack of jackals, my nephews, waiting for me to take my last breath so they can tear my empire apart. He stopped in front of her, his dark, calculating eyes studying her face, then sweeping over her heavy, curved body. Most men looked at her size with pity or mockery. Carmine looked at her with clinical approval. My empire is vast, Carmine continued. Legitimate real estate, offshore accounts, trusts that total in the hundreds of millions. But the primary family trust, the one that holds the keys to the kingdom, dictates that it can only pass to a direct, blood descendant. If I die without a child, the trust dissolves into the hands of the underbosses. My legacy turns to ash. Beatrice stared at him, the horrifying realization slowly dawning on her. What are you saying? I am saying, Beatrice, that your father owed me $500,000. You will pay it back by marrying me. You will give me a son, an heir to the Rossetti throne. In exchange, your father's debt is forgiven. You will never want for anything, and you will have the absolute protection of my name. Beatrice choked on her own breath. I'm 23. You're 70. You can't be serious. Why me? You could have any supermodel, any socialite in the city. Carmine chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. Socialites are fragile. They are vain, treacherous creatures who would sell me to the FBI the moment I turned my back, and they are starved to the bone. You? He tapped his cane against the floor. You are robust. You have wide hips, strong stock. You survived your father's miserable upbringing. You are a survivor, Beatrice. You are perfectly built to carry a child and survive the stress of my world. He leaned in close, the scent of expensive cologne and tobacco enveloping her. You have 24 hours to decide. Marry me and become a queen, or refuse, and Tommy takes you to the docks. I hear the water in Boston Harbor is freezing this time of year. 3 weeks later, Beatrice Hayes became Beatrice Rossetti. The wedding was held at a heavily guarded private compound on the cliffs of Cape Cod. It wasn't a celebration, it was a coronation, and the tension in the salty ocean air was thick enough to cut with a switchblade. Beatrice stood in front of a floor-to-ceiling mirror in the bridal suite, staring at a stranger. The designers had worked around the clock to create a custom Vera Wang gown that could accommodate her size 22 frame. The heavy ivory silk draped elegantly over her wide hips and thick waist, the corseted bodice pulling her in, adorned with $250,000 worth of hand-stitched Swarovski crystals. For the first time in her life, she didn't just feel big. She felt powerful. But outside this room, the wolves were waiting. As she walked down the aisle, clutching a bouquet of blood-red roses, Beatrice felt the piercing stares of the city's most dangerous criminals. The mob wives, dripping in diamonds and Botox, whispered behind manicured hands, their eyes mocking her weight, her soft chin, her lack of pedigree. They saw a fat, naive baker girl being led to the slaughter. Standing beside the priest was Carmine, looking formidable in a black tuxedo. He took her trembling, chubby hand in his dry, calloused one. His grip was surprisingly reassuring. When the priest pronounced them husband and wife, Carmine didn't kiss her lips. He kissed her forehead, a mark of possession, a seal on a contract. The reception was a lavish, terrifying affair. As Beatrice sat at the head table, picking at a plate of lobster risotto. She was too nauseous to eat. A tall, aggressively handsome man with slicked-back hair and a custom Tom Ford suit approached. This was Dominic Rossetti, Carmine's eldest nephew, and the man who had fully expected to inherit the empire. Dominic leaned over the table, his smile sharp and predatory. "Congratulations, Aunt Beatrice," he whispered, the title dripping with venom. I have to hand it to the old man. I didn't think he'd stoop to buying a prize pig from the slums just to spite me. Beatrice's face burned hot with shame, her instinct to shrink away taking over. But then she looked at Carmine, who was deep in conversation with a capo across the room, leaving her to defend herself. She remembered the freezing waters of the harbor. She wasn't just a baker anymore. Beatrice picked up her champagne flute, looking Dominic dead in the eye. "I'd watch your mouth, Dominic," she said, her voice surprisingly steady, though her hands shook beneath the tablecloth. "I might be from the slums, but I'm the one wearing the ring. And when I give your uncle a son, you'll be answering to me." Dominic's eyes flashed with a violent rage, the polite facade slipping for a fraction of a second. "You're a fat, stupid girl playing in a tank full of sharks. You won't last a month, sweetheart. Enjoy the caviar while you can." He turned and walked away, leaving Beatrice with a chilling realization. The debt to Carmine might have saved her life, but marrying him had put a target squarely on her back. That night, they were driven to Carmine's master estate. The wedding night was the unspoken, terrifying elephant in the room. Beatrice sat on the edge of the massive California king bed, clad in a silk nightgown that barely concealed her heavy curves. Her heart was beating frantically. How was this going to work? He was older than her grandfather. The door opened, and Carmine walked in. He had taken off his suit jacket and tie, looking suddenly much older, frailer. He poured a glass of water and took a handful of pills from a silver tray. He looked at her, seeing the sheer terror in her wide, dew-like eyes. "Relax, Beatrice," he said softly, sitting in a velvet armchair across from the bed. "I am an old man, not a monster. I know this is entirely transactional for you." Beatrice swallowed hard, pulling the silk robe tighter around her large frame. You said you wanted an heir. Tonight." "I need an heir," Carmine corrected, his gaze intense. "But I also need you alive and sane to raise him, because my time is shorter than anyone knows." He leaned forward, resting his hands on his cane. "My doctor gives me 18 months. Stage 4 pancreatic cancer. The family doesn't know. Dominic suspects, which is why he is circling like a vulture. If I die before you conceive, Dominic will kill you within the hour. You are only untouchable as long as you are carrying my blood or raising it." Beatrice's breath hitched. She wasn't just a womb. She was a ticking time bomb. "And if I get pregnant?" she asked, her voice shaking. "Dominic will just try to kill me before the baby is born." "Exactly," Carmine smiled, a genuine, grim smile. "Which is why you are going to learn how to be a Rossetti. You are going to learn how to shoot, how to read the accounting books, and how to spot a liar. Everyone looks at you and sees a fat, weak baker. They underestimate you. That is your greatest weapon, Beatrice." Carmine stood up and unbuttoned his shirt. "Now, we have a job to do. Close your eyes if you must, but remember why you are doing this. You are fighting for your life." The intimacy was strange, methodical, and detached, but not cruel. Carmine was surprisingly gentle, treating her body with a clinical reverence. For Beatrice, it was a profound psychological shift. As she lay in the dark, the heavy weight of the mob boss above her, she wasn't thinking of love or romance or the life she had lost. She was calculating. She was surviving. Weeks turned into a grueling, high-stakes game of chess. By day, Beatrice was paraded around the Boston underworld as the new Mrs. Rossetti. She endured the cruel whispers about her weight at the country clubs, the condescending smirks from the capos' wives, and the constant lurking threat of Dominic's shadow. But behind the closed doors of the Brookline estate, Carmine was keeping his promise. He brought in private tutors. Beatrice, who had spent her life measuring flour and sugar, was suddenly memorizing offshore shell company structures, recognizing the signs of wiretaps, and spending hours in the estate's underground firing range. The soft, invisible baker was slowly hardening into polished steel. 2 months after the wedding, Beatrice woke up in the middle of the night, rushing to the marble bathroom to vomit violently into the toilet. She sat on the cold floor, clutching a plastic stick with 2 pink lines. She was pregnant. She thought she would feel relief. She thought the safety net had finally opened beneath her. But as she washed her face in the sink, she noticed something strange. Her toothbrush, sitting in its usual silver cup, had a faint, powdery residue near the bristles. It wasn't toothpaste. It smelled faintly of bitter almonds. Cyanide. Someone inside the house was already making their move. And as Beatrice stared at her own terrified, tear-streaked face in the mirror, her hands resting on the slight swell of her stomach beneath her fat, she realized the horrifying truth. The game hadn't ended because she was pregnant. The real war had just begun. Beatrice stared at the faint white powder clinging to the bristles of her toothbrush, her reflection in the gilded bathroom mirror, pale and terrifyingly resolute. The old Beatrice, the fat, timid baker from the North End, would have screamed for her husband. She would have dissolved into a puddle of terrified tears, begging for a bodyguard, a flight out of Boston, anything to escape the creeping shadow of death. But that girl had died the day she walked down the aisle. The woman standing in the opulent Brookline bathroom was Beatrice Rossetti, and she was carrying a billion-dollar empire in her womb. She carefully wrapped the toothbrush in a silk handkerchief and slipped it into her pocket. She didn't alert Carmine. His health was failing faster than the doctors at Massachusetts General Hospital had predicted. The pancreatic cancer was a vicious, silent thief that was stripping the muscle from his bones daily. Stress would only accelerate his demise. If she was going to survive, she had to handle the vipers herself. That morning, Beatrice established her new reality. She sat at her antique mahogany vanity, brushing her hair, and cemented her strategy. She distilled her survival down to a strict set of internal mandates. The Rossetti Survival Protocol. Weaponize the weight. Let them see a soft, slow target. Hide Kevlar beneath the heavy, custom-tailored maternity dresses. Let them underestimate her mobility. Control the kitchen. As a baker, she understood ingredients. From now on, she would prepare all her own meals and Carmine's from scratch, locked inside the estate's private culinary wing. No outside staff permitted. By the Loyalists, Dominic had ambition, but capos like Tommy Knuckles. Graziano respected cash and stability. She needed to map the family's financial arteries and secure the loyalty of the men holding the guns. Beatrice took a deep breath, smoothing down her heavy velvet skirt over her expanding waistline, and walked out of the bedroom. The investigation started with the estate staff. Through careful, covert observation, Beatrice noticed Maria, a newly hired maid from Revere, acting nervously around the master suite. Using the skills Carmine had brutally drilled into her, Beatrice didn't confront the girl. Instead, she waited until Maria's day off, bypassed the estate's secondary security panel, and searched the girl's quarters. Tucked inside a hollowed-out paperback novel was a burner phone and a small glass vial containing the remaining bitter almond-scented powder. A quick scroll through the burner phone's encrypted texts revealed to the orchestrator. It wasn't just Dominic. He had aligned with the remnants of the Winter Hill Gang, an old Irish syndicate from Somerville, promising them a cut of the Rossetti Port operations in exchange for untraceable poisons and muscle. Armed with this knowledge, Beatrice finally went to Carmine. She found him in his wheelchair on the glass-enclosed veranda overlooking the Atlantic Ocean. He looked incredibly frail, his skin jaundiced, a heavy wool blanket draped over his lap. Yet, when she laid the handkerchief, the vial, and the burner phone on the table beside his scotch, his eyes burned with the old, terrifying fire of the dawn. "Maria," Beatrice stated, her voice as cold as the ocean wind outside. "Paid by Dominic, sourced from the Irish in Somerville." Carmine slowly reached out, his trembling, liver-spotted fingers tracing the glass vial. He looked up at Beatrice, his gaze sweeping over her robust, commanding figure. The sheer bulk of her presence, combined with her newfound icy demeanor, was magnificent to him. He smiled, a genuine, proud smile that didn't reach his hollow cheeks. "You didn't panic," Carmine rasped, coughing into a silk square. "You investigated. You gathered evidence. You thought like a boss." "I am a mother, protecting her child," Beatrice replied flatly, resting a hand on her pregnant belly. "What do we do about Dominic?" "We do nothing," Carmine said softly. "You do. It is time, Beatrice. I am fading. By the end of the week, I will be confined to a hospital bed. If I order the hit on my own nephew, the commission in New York will see it as the paranoid act of a dying man. They might sanction a war. But if you outmaneuver him, if you crush him publicly, they will respect you. They will fear you." He reached into his pocket and handed her a heavy iron key. "Safe deposit box at State Street Bank, box 404. It contains the blackmail files on every capo in the Northeast, the bearer bonds to pay for a private army, and the legal transfer of the Rossetti family trust. The moment my heart stops, you own everything, but you must survive until that moment." 3 days later, Carmine collapsed. I was rushed to Mass General Hospital under the cover of darkness. The entire 8th floor was locked down, swarming with private security, but the scent of blood was in the water. Word leaked rapidly through the underworld that the king was on his deathbed. Dominic didn't wait. It happened at 2:00 a.m. on a Tuesday. Beatrice was sitting beside Carmine's bed, the heart monitor beeping in a steady, agonizingly slow rhythm. She was wearing a heavy, dark wool coat over a thick maternity dress. Suddenly, the lights on the floor flickered and died. The emergency backup generators failed to kick in immediately. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the muffled sound of a suppressed gunshot from the hallway outside. The guards were being neutralized. Beatrice stood up. Her heart hammered against her ribs, but her hands were perfectly steady. She reached into her oversized designer handbag and pulled out a suppressed Glock 19. The hospital door eased open. Two men stepped in, wearing dark tactical gear, night vision goggles strapped to their helmets. They didn't even look at her. Their weapons immediately raised toward the bed where Carmine lay motionless. They assumed the fat, pregnant Baker would be cowering in the corner. It was a fatal miscalculation. Using her size as an anchor, Beatrice planted her feet in a wide, stable stance. She didn't hesitate. She fired twice. The hollow-point bullets shattered the tactical visor of the first assassin, dropping him instantly. The second man spun around, shock registering in his posture, but he was too slow. Beatrice fired 3 more times, the dull thwip, thwip, thwip of the suppressor echoing in the dark room as the man collapsed against the medical cart. She stood over them, her breath pluming in the cold, air-conditioned room. Carmine's eyes were open, watching her from the bed. He couldn't speak, the oxygen mask hissing over his face. But he slowly raised 2 fingers in a silent salute. He closed his eyes. The heart monitor flatlined. Carmine Rossetti was dead, and the Baker was now the queen. The mourning period was a theatrical farce. The funeral at the Cathedral of the Holy Cross was packed with federal agents snapping photographs, politicians pretending they didn't know the deceased, and hundreds of made men paying their respects to the widow. Beatrice sat in the front pew, heavily pregnant, clad in a custom black mourning veil and a tailored coat that draped over her large, formidable frame. She didn't shed a single tear. Dominic sat across the aisle, wearing a perfectly tailored Brioni suit, his face contorted into a mask of false grief, though his eyes darted toward Beatrice with naked, venomous ambition. He thought the hospital hit had failed due to incompetent contractors. I didn't know Beatrice had pulled the trigger. The real battle was scheduled for that evening. The sit-down tradition dictated that the transition of power must be formally acknowledged by the capos. Dominic had called the meeting at Mamma Maria, a highly exclusive, mob-controlled Italian restaurant tucked away in North Square. He intended to declare the family trust dissolved, label Beatrice an illegitimate interloper, and seize the empire by force if necessary. At 8:11 p.m., the private dining room on the second floor was thick with cigar smoke and tension. 12 of the most dangerous men in New England sat around a long oak table. Dominic sat at the head, the traditional seat of the boss. "My uncle lost his mind at the end," Dominic addressed the room, pouring himself a glass of Barolo. "He married a heavy, ignorant civilian to settle a gambling debt. She's a joke. A fat pastry chef carrying a bastard she'll claim is his. I am the blood. I am taking over the port operations, the State Street accounts, and the unions. Tonight." The heavy oak doors to the dining room swung open. Beatrice walked in. She did not look like a grieving widow, nor did she look like a victim. She wore a deep crimson maternity gown that boldly accentuated her massive 8-month pregnant belly, covered in a black mink coat. She looked like absolute royalty. Flanking her were 4 heavily armed men, but they weren't just any men. At her immediate right was Tommy Knuckles Gratiano, Dominic's most feared enforcer. Dominic's smug expression faltered, a flicker of genuine panic crossing his eyes. "Tommy? What the hell are you doing? Get that cow out of here." Tommy didn't flinch. He kept his hands resting near his holster, his eyes locked on Dominic. Beatrice walked slowly, heavily, toward the head of the table. The floorboards creaked under her weight, the sound commanding absolute silence in the room. She stopped directly beside Dominic. "You sit in my husband's chair, Dominic," Beatrice said, her voice dripping with aristocratic disdain. It was smooth, loud, and unwavering. "It's my chair now, sweetheart," Dominic spat, though a bead of sweat rolled down his temple. "You have no power here. The trust," Beatrice interrupted, reaching into her mink coat and tossing a thick leather binder onto the table, "transfers entirely to the surviving spouse, holding the unborn blood heir." State Street Bank confirmed the transition this afternoon. "I control the hundreds of millions in the offshore accounts. I control the real estate. I control the payroll." She leaned down, placing her large, diamond-ringed hands on the table, looming over Dominic. Her sheer physical presence was suffocating him. "I went to State Street Box 404, Dominic. I found Carmine's ledgers. I know about the skim from the Somerville docks. I know about the bribes to the Irish. But more importantly," she gestured to the capos sitting around the room, "I took $5 million in cash from the reserve vault this morning. I doubled the weekly kickbacks for every man in this room. I bought their loyalty while you were picking out your funeral suit." The capos remained dead silent, their eyes averted from Dominic. They were businessmen. The fat widow had the legal paperwork, the trust fund, and she was paying double. The choice was violently simple. Dominic stood up, his face flushed with desperate rage. He reached for his jacket pocket, intending to draw his weapon. "I wouldn't do that, kid," Tommy grunted, his own pistol drawn and pressed directly against the base of Dominic's skull before the younger man could even clear leather. Beatrice didn't flinch at the sight of the gun. She looked at Dominic with the cold, dead eyes of a predator. The transformation was complete. "You called me a prize pig, Dominic," Beatrice whispered, so only he could hear. "You tried to poison my toothbrush. You sent assassins into my husband's hospital room. You thought because I am fat, because I am quiet, that I am weak. But you forgot one thing about pigs, Dominic." She leaned back, her hand resting protectively over her child. "They eat everything, including the bones." Beatrice looked at Tommy and gave a subtle, almost imperceptible nod. "Take him to the harbor," Beatrice commanded the room, her voice echoing off the brick walls. "I hear the water is freezing this time of year." As Dominic was dragged screaming and kicking from the restaurant, Beatrice took the seat at the head of the table. She smoothed her dress over her wide hips and looked at the 12 hardened criminals, staring back at her in pure, unadulterated awe. "Gentlemen," Queen Beatrice said, pouring herself a glass of sparkling water, "let's review the quarterly books." A month later, Beatrice gave birth to a healthy 10-pound baby boy. She named him Carmine Arthur Rossetti. I was the undisputed heir to the largest criminal empire on the East Coast. But everyone in Boston knew the terrifying truth. The boy would one day wear the crown, but the throne belonged forever to the baker. Did Beatrice's ruthless transformation from a terrified baker into a formidable mob queen leave you completely speechless? She proved that underestimating someone based on their appearance is a fatal mistake in the underworld. If you loved this intense, twist-filled mafia drama, hit that like button right now. Share this story with your friends who love a fierce revenge plot, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more thrilling, jaw-dropping stories every single week.